In 1348, a disease arrived in England so horrifying that doctors nailed families alive inside their own homes. Half the country was dead within 2 years, and what really happened was far worse than any history book dares to describe. In August 1348, ships carrying goods from France docked at the port of Weymouth on England's south coast. They brought silk, wine, spices, and something else, something invisible, something that had already killed a third of Asia. Medieval chroniclers tried to describe what they were witnessing. One wrote, "The living were scarcely sufficient to bury the dead." Another left his record unfinished, mid-sentence. He had died before he could complete it. The Black Death was caused by a bacterium called Yersinia pestis, carried by fleas that lived on rats. When the rats died, the fleas moved to humans. In one bite, the flea deposited enough bacteria to begin the process of killing a person in less than a week. It began quietly, a neighbor sick, a child not playing outside, a silence where there should be noise. By the time people understood what was coming, it was already inside their village, their house, their body. Within 6 months of the disease's arrival in England, it had reached London. The city of 80,000 people, the largest city in Britain, would lose half its population in the next 2 years. The dying happened so fast that the living could not keep pace with the dead. The plague announced itself quietly, a fever, a headache, aching muscles. Many victims thought they had a cold. They were dead within a week. Then came the buboes, swellings in the lymph nodes, the groin, the armpit, the neck, that grew to the size of eggs, sometimes apples. They were exquisitely painful. Moving your arm, turning your head, sitting down became impossible without agony. The buboes filled with pus, blood, and fluid. They hardened, they softened again. Some burst, releasing fluid of an extraordinary smell. Physicians who came to treat patients described the smell as the single most unbearable aspect of the disease. Physicians attempted to lance the buboes, to cut them open and drain them. Some patients briefly improved, most didn't. The pain of the procedure on already dying patients was considered by some so cruel that it was described as its own form of torture. Then the skin. In the most severe cases, blood leaked under the skin, creating dark patches, sometimes black, sometimes dark purple, that spread across the body. This is why some called it the Black Death. The black was underneath the skin, hemorrhaging as the body systems collapsed. The smell was so distinctive and so overwhelming that survivors could describe it decades later. One physician wrote that entering a house with plague victims was like entering a charnel house and an open sewer simultaneously. Some survivors reported never being able to eat certain foods again because the smell association was too strong. The final days of a plague victim were the most horrifying. The bacteria had spread to the bloodstream, septicemic plague, causing the body's organs to begin failing simultaneously. Gangrene set into the extremities, the fingers, the toes, the nose, the tissue dying while the person was still alive. Most people who developed full symptoms were dead within 3 to 5 days. Some lasted a week. A very small number, perhaps 1 in 10, survived. Nobody at the time understood why some lived and most died. Survival seemed random, divine, or its opposite. Parish records from 1348 tell the story without elaboration, page after page of names, dates, and the same word, mortuus, dead. The entries crowd each other off the page as the dying accelerated faster than the records could follow. The plague doctor was one of the most recognizable figures in medieval Europe. The long coat, the brimmed hat, the crystal eyes in the mask, and above all, the long curved beak. Inside the beak, herbs, spices, dried flowers. The doctor genuinely believed that good smells could counteract the bad smells that caused the disease. The miasma theory, the idea that disease was caused by bad air, by rotting smells, by corrupted atmosphere, was the dominant medical understanding of the 14th century. It was completely wrong, but it drove every medical decision made during the Black Death. Medieval physicians diagnosed illness by examining urine. Its color, smell, and consistency mapped to charts that categorized every possible state of health. The symptom charts were a serious and sophisticated system. They had simply never encountered anything like what they were looking at in 1348. Treatments included applying the entrails of dead pigeons to the buboes, rubbing the skin with herbs, bloodletting to release corrupted humors, and prayers addressed to specific saints. Every treatment was tried. None worked. Physicians kept trying because stopping felt like abandoning their patients to die alone. Some physicians refused to attend plague victims. Their reasoning was practical. Attendance meant exposure meant death, and dead physicians helped no one. Other physicians went into the houses every day, knowing they were likely to die, doing everything they could with tools they knew were inadequate. The church offered prayer, processions, and the sacraments, and when those failed, some priests performed them anyway on the street, through open windows, from a distance, because the dying could not be left without the last rites. Many of those priests died days later. The Faculty of Medicine in Paris issued an official explanation of the plague. A conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in the sign of Aquarius had caused a great pestilence by corrupting the air. They were wrong about the cause. Their attempt to understand the unknowable was, in its way, the most human response in this entire story. The graveyards filled faster than the gravediggers could dig. New burial grounds were opened, in fields, in gardens, in the courtyards of monasteries. The church consecrated new ground as fast as it could, struggling to maintain the theological framework of Christian burial for every corpse. The death carts moved at night because the daytime crowds made movement impossible. The bell the carters rang was not ceremony, it was warning, telling people to clear the street, to avoid the cart, to step back from the dead being transported through their neighborhood. Modern archaeologists excavating medieval plague pits have found something unexpected: organization. The bodies were not thrown in randomly. They were laid in rows, on their backs, heads to the west in the Christian tradition. Even in catastrophe, someone was maintaining the rituals of respect. Some monasteries lost every member within weeks. The church lost perhaps half of its clergy in England during the first wave of the plague. Communities that had maintained religious practice for centuries found themselves without anyone qualified to lead a service or perform a burial. The Black Death did not respect class. Lords and peasants died at similar rates. The Archbishop of Canterbury died of the plague. 3 subsequent archbishops died of it within a year. The King of Castile, the Queen of Cyprus, the daughter of the King of England, all killed by the same bacterium that was killing anonymous peasants in English fields. Perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of the Black Death was what it demanded of its survivors: abandonment. To protect yourself, you had to leave the sick. The dying were left alone because tending them meant joining them. Children left their parents. Parents left their children. The survivor accounts are the most disturbing documents from the Black Death. Not because of the horror they describe, but because of the calm with which they describe it. The human capacity to process the unprocessable, to keep going, to note down what happened and continue. By 1350, the Black Death had killed somewhere between a third and half of England's entire population, 2.5 million people. Gone in less than 2 years. The landscape was physically altered, villages abandoned, fields unplanted, the social structure of the country fractured beyond recognition. The survivors faced something for which there was no framework and no precedent. Half the people they had ever known were dead. The economic system had collapsed. The social system had fractured, and they had to somehow build the world back from what remained. Some English towns lost so many people that they were never rebuilt. Deserted medieval villages, over 1,000 of them, are traceable across England today. Places that had names, populations, histories, reduced to grass-covered outlines by the Black Death. When plague entered a household, some communities took drastic action. The entire family was sealed inside, the door nailed shut. Food passed through a slot or dropped in the street. The living quarantined alongside the dying, the healthy condemned alongside the sick. Venice was the first city to formalize quarantine, making ships stay in the harbor for 40 days. 40 giorni, the origin of the word quarantine, before their crew could disembark. England followed with its own versions. The science was wrong. The instinct was right. Isolation did limit spread. Inside the sealed house, those who had not yet developed symptoms faced a specific terror: waiting. They knew what was coming. They had seen it in their neighbor, their spouse, their child. The incubation period meant they might wait 3 to 5 days before showing symptoms, or might not show them at all. The psychological torture of sealed quarantine was documented by contemporary observers. The well were imprisoned with the sick. Children watched parents die. Parents watched children die. And when the door was finally opened, if any were still alive, they emerged into a world that had continued without them. Legal records survive of disputes about quarantine seals, neighbors who complained, families who broke through sealed doors, officials who defended the practice as the only tool available. The debates were not abstract. They were about specific families, specific houses, specific children behind specific nailed doors. When a sealed house went silent, when the food stopped being taken, when no sound came from inside, the question was whether to open it immediately or wait longer to ensure the disease was no longer active. Some houses were simply burned with their contents inside. The burning of infected houses and their contents was not madness. It was reasoning from incorrect premises. If the disease came from bad air and corrupted matter, then destroying that matter made sense. The conclusion was practical. The understanding was wrong. The fire was real. Opening a sealed house after weeks of silence was an act described by those who did it as the worst thing they had ever experienced. Not just the smell, though the smell was indescribable, but the evidence of normal life interrupted. The bread half made, the game half played, the letter half written. The village of Eyam in Derbyshire is 12 miles from Sheffield. In September 1665, a tailor's assistant named George Vickers received a bundle of cloth from London. He laid it out to dry near his fire. Within a week, he was dead. The cloth from London carried plague fleas. George Vickers was the first to die. Within weeks, the disease had spread through neighboring households. The village realized what it was facing, and then its rector asked them to do something extraordinary. Reverend William Mompesson proposed a voluntary quarantine, not of individual houses, but of the entire village. Nobody leaves, no one enters. The surrounding villages and towns would leave food and supplies at specific boundary stones. In return, Eyam would contain the disease within itself. The boundary stones of Eyam still exist. Villagers left money, coins soaked in vinegar, which they believed would disinfect them, at the stones in exchange for food. Outsiders took the money without coming closer. The transaction of self-sacrifice carried out in total silence on a hillside. Mompesson moved church services outdoors, to a natural hollow called Cucklet Delph, so the congregation could maintain distance from each other. He preached the same sermon for 14 months, that their suffering had meaning, that their sacrifice would save lives beyond the quarantine line. The burial register of Eyam tells the story in numbers. In the first months, the deaths were occasional. By the summer of 1666, the register was being updated daily. The pattern of a disease moving through a contained population, recorded in careful handwriting, line by line, name by name. Elizabeth Hancock buried her husband and 6 of her children in 8 days in August 1666. She dug each grave herself in a field called Riley, carrying each body from her house. No one could help her. The surviving villagers were either ill or observing distance. She worked alone in the summer heat. Riley Field still has the graves. 7 small stones in a limestone field on the edge of the moors. On some days you can be the only person there. Standing in that field, you can begin to understand what she carried out alone on those August days in 1666. Catherine Mompesson, the rector's wife, refused to leave. She assisted her husband through the entire quarantine, visiting the sick and organizing the community response. In August 1666, she developed symptoms. She died within days. Mompesson buried his wife in the plague year, in the village he had asked to seal itself. Mompesson wrote to a friend after Catherine's death, "She was a rare wife, more value than rubies, a blessing to me beyond expression. God has taken from me the delight of mine eyes." He buried her, and he kept going. He kept the quarantine in place. In November 1666, the plague in Eyam burned out. The quarantine had lasted 14 months. Of roughly 350 inhabitants, approximately 260 had died. The village that had sealed itself had lost 3/4 of its population and had almost certainly prevented the plague from spreading to Sheffield, Bakewell, and the surrounding towns. Eyam today is a village of memorial. Every summer, a service is held in Cucklet Delph, where Mompesson preached outdoors during the plague, to commemorate the sacrifice of the quarantine community. The boundary stones are maintained. The graves in Riley Field are tended. The Black Death changed England so profoundly that some historians consider it the true beginning of the modern age. When half the workforce dies, the rules of labor have to change. The Black Death created the labor shortage that broke feudalism. Surviving peasants could now demand wages, could move to where the pay was better, could refuse to work for lords who didn't pay them. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 was the political expression of a change that the plague had made economically inevitable. The Church's failure to explain or stop the plague destroyed its intellectual monopoly on answers to life's big questions. The era of questioning, of demanding better explanations, of refusing to accept authority without evidence, that eventually produced the Renaissance had its roots in the plague's devastation of medieval certainties. Modern scientists have recovered the genetic material of Yersinia pestis from the teeth of medieval plague victims, from mass graves in England, France, and Germany. The bacterium that killed half of Europe has been sequenced. We know it now, completely, in ways the men and women of 1348 could not have imagined. Walk across almost any English county, and you will find them. The earthwork outlines of deserted medieval villages, their streets and building plots preserved in the grass. Villages that had names, populations, histories, and that were emptied by the Black Death and never refilled. Beneath the streets of modern London lie the mass graves of the Black Death. East Smithfield, West Smithfield, Clerkenwell. The emergency burial grounds opened in 1348 to handle the dying faster than the parish churchyards could manage. Millions of people walk over them every day. The Black Death was the direct ancestor of every pandemic response protocol we use today. Quarantine, contact tracing, isolation of the infectious, the closure of public gatherings. Medieval people invented these tools in desperation without understanding why they worked. We use them with understanding. The underlying emergency is the same. England survived. Europe survived. The human race survived a biological catastrophe that killed perhaps 50 million people in 4 years. The survival was not inevitable. It required people to keep digging graves, keep treating the sick, keep preaching, keep planting fields, keep raising children. The survivors of the Black Death carved the dance macabre into their church walls. The dance of death in which a skeleton leads every person regardless of rank toward the same end. The plague had made the equality of death visible in a way that could not be unseen. The art of the survivors is the art of people who have looked at something real. The question the Black Death leaves for us, now, today, is not academic. It is, what would you have done? Would you have stayed in Eyam? Would you have nailed the door shut? Would you have put on the beak mask and walked into the house? In 1348, ordinary people faced extraordinary choices with no more preparation than we have. What would your answer be? Tell us in the comments.